On a gray Thursday morning in early October of 1998, the lobby of the First Prairie Community Bank smelled faintly of floor polish and fresh paper. The kind of quiet place where nothing unusual ever seemed to happen. Farmers came in to deposit crop payments. Retired couples withdrew cash for groceries. Small business owners balanced ledgers at the counter beneath soft fluorescent lights. Everything moved slowly, predictably, like the ticking of the brass clock mounted above the teller windows. And that morning would have passed exactly the same way if not for the man who walked through the glass doors at 9:17 a.m. His name was Harold Whitaker. Harold was 72 years old, tall but slightly stooped, with the slow deliberate movements of someone who had spent most of his life working outdoors. His denim jacket had faded to a pale blue after years of sun and washing. The cuffs of his sleeves were frayed. His boots were clean but worn smooth across the toes. The kind of boots that had walked across fields more often than sidewalks. In his hand he carried a simple canvas envelope. No briefcase. No leather wallet. Just that envelope. The moment he stepped inside, the lobby quieted in the subtle way rooms sometimes do when someone unfamiliar appears. Not silent, exactly. Just a shift in attention. A man in a suit glanced up from the lone desk. Two tellers exchanged a quick look. Harold walked slowly across the polished floor toward the front counter, pausing once to remove his hat. The hat was old felt, dark brown, shaped by years of use. He held it carefully in both hands as though the bank itself deserved that small sign of respect. There were 3 people already waiting in line. A young real estate agent in a tailored blazer, tapping impatiently on her phone. A contractor wearing reflective work gear, holding a stack of checks. And a sharply dressed man in a charcoal suit who looked like he had stepped directly out of a business magazine advertisement. Harold stepped quietly to the back of the line. The contractor glanced back first. His eyes moved slowly from Harold's boots to his jacket to the envelope in his hand. Then he turned back around. A moment later he leaned slightly toward the man in the suit and murmured something under his breath. The suited man smirked. Neither of them bothered lowering their voices very much. Looks like someone wandered in from the livestock auction. The contractor chuckled softly. Harold said nothing. He simply stood there holding his hat and envelope, patiently waiting his turn. At the teller counter, a young woman named Melissa was finishing a deposit for the real estate agent. Melissa had been working at the bank for 6 months and had already learned to recognize people by appearance before they even spoke. Expensive watch. Clean briefcase. Designer handbag. Those were the customers who expected speed. Those were the customers who complained if anything took longer than 2 minutes. And standing at the back of the line now was someone who clearly did not belong to that category. Melissa glanced up briefly. Her eyes paused on Harold. Then moved away again. The contractor finished his transaction and stepped aside. The man in the suit went next, sliding a thick folder across the counter. I need a cashier's check issued today, he said briskly. Closing paperwork. Melissa nodded politely and began typing. Behind him, Harold waited quietly. The suited man finished his paperwork within 2 minutes and turned as he left the counter. For the first time he looked directly at Harold. He hesitated just long enough to notice the envelope in the old farmer's hand. What have you got there? He asked casually. Seed money. The contractor laughed again from near the door. Harold looked up calmly. His voice was gentle. Just some paperwork. The suited man smiled thinly. Well, I hope they accept chickens and corn as deposits. Another quiet chuckle drifted through the lobby. Melissa heard it. She also noticed Harold's expression. Or rather the lack of one. He didn't look embarrassed. He didn't look angry. He simply stepped forward when the line cleared and approached the counter. Melissa offered the polite but automatic smile bank tellers learn early in their careers. Good morning, sir. How can I help you today? Harold placed the canvas envelope gently on the counter. I'd like to speak with the branch manager. Melissa blinked once. That depends, she said carefully. What is it regarding? Harold slid the envelope a few inches closer. An account. Melissa tapped her keyboard. Are you opening a new one today? Harold shook his head slowly. No, ma'am. I believe I already have one. There was a pause. The kind that lasts only a second but feels longer. Melissa glanced again at the envelope. Then back at Harold. Do you have your account number? Harold opened the envelope carefully and removed a folded document. The paper was yellowed with age. He slid it across the counter. Melissa picked it up. At first glance it looked like an ordinary banking document. Then she noticed the date printed at the top. June 12, 1963. Melissa frowned slightly. Sir, this appears to be very old paperwork. Harold nodded. Yes, ma'am. That's when I opened the account. The contractor by the door snorted quietly. Melissa gave a polite but uncertain smile. Let me just take a look. She began typing into the bank's system. One search. Nothing appeared. She tried again using a variation of the name. Still nothing. Melissa cleared her throat gently. I'm sorry, sir, but I'm not finding anything under this record. Harold nodded again, as if he expected that. That's all right. He leaned slightly closer to the counter. That's why I asked for the manager. Across the lobby, the man in the charcoal suit had paused near the door. Something about the quiet farmer still standing at the counter had caught his curiosity. He watched as Melissa hesitated. Then reached for the phone beside her keyboard. Mr. Halvorsen, she said softly. Could you come to the front desk for a moment? A door at the back of the bank opened. And a moment later, the branch manager stepped into the lobby. The branch manager of First Prairie Community Bank was a man named Robert Halvorsen. He had been working in banking for nearly 25 years, long enough to recognize the rhythms of a quiet rural branch. Most mornings followed the same predictable pattern: crop deposits, loan questions, the occasional mortgage closing. Nothing dramatic. Nothing complicated. So when Melissa called him from the teller counter, he expected something routine. A missing form. A customer confused about paperwork. But the moment Robert stepped out of his office and looked across the lobby, he sensed something slightly different. 3 people had stopped what they were doing. The contractor near the door. The sharply dressed businessman who had already finished his transaction but hadn't quite left yet. And Melissa, standing behind the counter holding a sheet of old yellow paper. Robert walked toward them slowly. What seems to be the issue? He asked calmly. Melissa handed him the document. This gentleman says he opened an account here in 1963, but I can't find anything in the system. Robert glanced at the paper. At first, he saw exactly what Melissa had seen. Old typewritten text. Faded bank letterhead. A date printed in the corner that belonged to a different era. June 12, 1963. Robert lifted his eyes toward the man standing at the counter. Harold Whittaker still held his hat politely in both hands. Mud stains darkened the seams of his boots, and the sleeves of his denim jacket were worn thin with time. Yet there was something about his posture, something steady and unhurried, that caught Robert's attention. You believe you opened an account here? Robert asked. Yes, sir, Harold replied quietly. Robert looked back down at the document. Do you happen to know the account number? Harold nodded once. It should be printed on the second page. Robert flipped the paper over. There it was. 7 digits. Old-style numbering used decades before modern banking software replaced the original ledgers. Robert felt a faint flicker of curiosity. Give me a moment, he said. Behind him, the suited man leaned casually against the wall, still watching. This should be good, he murmured quietly to the contractor. Robert didn't hear him. He was already turning back toward Melissa's computer terminal. Let's try something different, he said. Robert typed the account number exactly as it appeared on the document. The system paused. For a moment nothing happened. Then a small notification appeared on the screen. Archived record, manual review required. Robert frowned slightly. Archived? Melissa leaned closer. What does that mean? It means the system recognizes the number but the account predates the digital database. He clicked open the record. A loading circle spun briefly. Then another message appeared. Record stored in legacy ledger system. Robert leaned back slightly. That was unusual. Very unusual. The bank had digitized nearly every account in the late 1980s. Anything older had typically been closed, transferred, or absorbed into newer accounts long ago. Sir, Robert said, turning back toward Harold, have you made any transactions on this account recently? Harold shook his head. No, sir. How recently? Harold thought for a moment. Not since the 70s. The contractor burst out laughing. 70s? This guy thinks banks work like pickle jars. The suited man chuckled softly. Robert ignored both of them. Instead he studied Harold carefully. Do you happen to remember how much was in the account? Harold nodded again. $10,000. The laughter behind them grew louder. $10,000, the contractor repeated. That must have been his whole farm. But Robert still wasn't smiling. $10,000 in 1963 was not a small deposit. In fact, in rural Iowa during the early 1960s, it was a very large one. Do you have any other paperwork? Robert asked. Harold reached back into the envelope. He removed a second document. This one was smaller. A folded deposit certificate. Robert took it carefully. The bank's old logo sat printed at the top of the page. Beneath it were the words. Long-term holding account. Robert's eyebrows lifted slightly. He turned the page and read further. Then he looked again at the date. And below that. A handwritten signature. Not Harold's. Someone else's. Robert's expression changed. Where did you get this? He asked quietly. My father gave it to me, Harold said. Robert studied the signature again. The name was familiar. Not just familiar. Historic. Because the man who signed that document had been the founder of First Prairie Community Bank. The original owner. Back when the bank itself had only been 2 years old. Robert felt a strange tightening in his chest. He turned back toward the computer. There's an old archive room downstairs, he said quietly to Melissa. What's down there? She asked. Paper ledgers. How old? Robert looked at Harold again. Possibly as old as this account. The contractor scoffed. You're seriously going to dig through 40-year-old paperwork for this? Robert didn't respond. Instead he folded the document carefully and placed it back inside the envelope. Then he looked directly at Harold Whitaker. Sir, would you mind waiting a few minutes? Harold nodded politely. I've waited 35 years. A few minutes is fine. The suited man laughed again under his breath. But Robert wasn't listening anymore. Because something about that signature on the paper had triggered a memory. And if his memory was correct, then this quiet old farmer standing in the bank lobby might not be asking about $10,000. Robert turned to Melissa. Watch the desk. Then he walked quickly toward the staircase leading down to the archive room. The contractor shook his head. Unbelievable, he muttered. But Harold Whitaker simply stood at the counter, holding his hat, as patiently as before. Because he already knew what the manager was about to find. Robert Halvorson had only been inside the archive room twice in his entire career. The bank kept it mostly for legal compliance. Boxes of old ledgers, tax filings, and records from an era before computers took over the work of remembering. The room sat beneath the main floor, behind a metal door that stayed locked unless someone had a very specific reason to open it. Robert unlocked it now. The hinges groaned as the door swung inward. Dust hung faintly in the air. Rows of shelves stretched across the room, filled with long cardboard boxes and thick leather-bound books that looked more like museum pieces than financial records. Each shelf was labeled by decade. 1960 to 1965. 1965 to 1970. Robert stepped inside slowly. Most people thought banks ran on money. But Robert knew the truth. Banks ran on records. Without records, money was just paper. He walked toward the shelves labeled 1960 to 1965 and scanned the rows carefully until he spotted what he was looking for. General Deposit Ledger. The book was enormous, nearly the size of a suitcase, bound in cracked brown leather. When Robert lifted it from the shelf, dust scattered into the air like fine powder. He carried it to a small wooden table in the center of the room. For a moment he simply stared at the cover. The weight of the ledger was astonishing. Every account the bank held in 1963 was recorded inside it. Every deposit. Every withdrawal. Every promise the bank had ever made to its customers. Robert opened the book slowly. The paper inside was yellowed but still perfectly legible, written in neat rows of blue ink from a fountain pen. Names filled the pages. Farmers. Shop owners. Local families whose children and grandchildren probably still lived somewhere in the county. Robert turned the pages carefully, searching for the account number Harold Whitaker had provided. 7 digits. Old system numbering. The kind used before computers ever entered a bank building. He ran his finger down each column. Account numbers. Customer names. Balances. Then he found it. Account number 437-2164. Robert leaned closer. The name beside it read. Whitaker, Thomas. Not Harold. Thomas. Robert remembered what the farmer had said upstairs. My father gave it to me. Robert followed the line across the page. Initial deposit, $10,000. Date, June 12, 1963. Robert let out a slow breath. The account was real. Completely real. But that wasn't the part that made him pause. What stopped him was the note written in red ink beside the deposit. A handwritten instruction. Placed there by the bank's original owner. Robert leaned closer to read it. Long-term holding account. Do not close. Interest to accrue annually. Manual review required upon claimant request. Robert blinked once. Manual review. That explained the alert on the computer system upstairs. This account had never been converted to digital records. It had remained here. Locked inside this ledger. Untouched for decades. Robert turned to the next page. Each year had been recorded by hand. Interest added. Interest added. Another entry. Year after year. Sometimes written by different bank clerks as employees changed over the decades. But the instructions had always remained the same. Do not close. Interest to accrue annually. Robert flipped forward it. Even after the bank switched to computerized records, someone had continued updating the ledger manually. The handwriting changed. But the entries continued. Robert reached the final page. The last entry had been written in black ballpoint ink instead of fountain pen. Balance updated. Interest applied. Robert sat back slowly. The account had never been closed. Never withdrawn. Never transferred. Which meant something extraordinary had been quietly happening for nearly 30 years. Interest. Compound interest. Robert did a quick calculation in his head. $10,000 in 1963. Left untouched. Accumulating interest every year. He felt his pulse quicken slightly. That kind of growth didn't happen in small amounts. It multiplied. Robert flipped back to the final page again. And this time he looked carefully at the number written beside the most recent entry. The figure was written clearly. No mistakes. No corrections. Just one long line of digits. Robert stared at it. Then he checked it again. Then one more time. Because sometimes your brain refuses to accept what your eyes are seeing. The balance was not $10,000. Not $50,000. Not even $100,000. Robert stood up slowly. He closed the ledger carefully and carried it back toward the stairs. Upstairs, the bank lobby looked exactly the same as when he left. Melissa stood behind the counter. The contractor was still near the door. The suited man had taken a seat in one of the waiting chairs, clearly entertained by the entire situation. And Harold Whittaker still stood quietly at the counter holding his hat. Robert walked toward them. The ledger weighed heavily in his arms. Melissa noticed him first. "Did you find something?" Robert placed the massive book on the counter. The sound of it landing made everyone turn. Even the contractor stopped smiling. Robert opened the ledger to the final page. Then he rotated the book slowly so Melissa could read it. Her eyes scanned the entry. She blinked once. Then twice. "What is that number?" she whispered. The contractor leaned closer out of curiosity. He squinted at the page. Then his expression changed. The suited man stood up. "Let me see that." Robert didn't move. Because he wasn't looking at them anymore. He was looking at Harold Whittaker. The old farmer stood exactly as before. Calm. Patient. Almost as if he had expected this moment all along. Robert cleared his throat quietly. "Mr. Whittaker." The room had gone completely silent. "Your father opened this account in 1963 with $10,000. Harold nodded. "Yes, sir." Robert placed his finger beside the final entry in the ledger. "Since then, the bank has applied interest every single year." He paused briefly. The contractor shifted his weight nervously. Melissa covered her mouth. Robert looked Harold directly in the eyes. "Which means, as of today, the balance in this account is." He tapped the number written in ink. And suddenly the laughter that had filled the lobby earlier that morning felt like it belonged to a completely different world. The silence that followed was different from the earlier one. Before, it had been the silence of ridicule waiting to explode. Now it was the silence of people realizing they might have misjudged something important. Mr. Deshmukh slowly lowered himself back into his chair. He looked again at the name on the screen. Raghunath Prasad. He repeated it quietly. Across the lobby, the man in the dusty kurta remained standing near the counter, his hands folded loosely in front of him. His daughter had moved closer to his side, holding on to the edge of his sleeve. She didn't understand what was happening. But she could feel the tension. The manager took a slow breath. Then he opened another file. Transaction history. The first entry appeared. Fixed deposit, 25,000 Indian rupees. Another entry. Renewed. Renewed again. Interest accumulated. Reinvested. Additional deposit. The numbers kept growing. Not dramatically. But steadily. Year after year. Quietly. Patiently. The kind of growth that only comes from discipline. From someone who understood the value of waiting. From someone who didn't chase quick gains. The assistant manager leaned closer. "Sir, this account hasn't been touched in decades." Mr. Deshmukh nodded slowly. "Exactly." He scrolled further. Agricultural bonds. Government schemes. Rural investment programs. Each one tied to the same name. Each one reinvested automatically. And each one now worth far more than when it began. The assistant swallowed. "How much is the total?" The manager didn't answer immediately. He ran the final calculation. The system processed the numbers. Interest. Compounding. Adjustments. Decades of quiet growth. Finally the figure appeared. Mr. Deshmukh stared at it. For a moment he didn't speak. Then he stood up again. This time more quickly. The assistant looked confused. Sir. But the manager was already walking out of his office. The glass door opened. The lobby turned to watch. The man who had been ignored only minutes earlier was still standing at the counter. Patient. Unbothered. Mr. Deshmukh walked directly toward him. The room grew silent again. Even the customers who had laughed earlier were watching now. The manager stopped in front of the farmer. Then something unexpected happened. He joined his palms respectfully. Namaste, Mr. Prasad. The room froze. The cashier looked shocked. The assistant manager had followed behind and now stood quietly to the side. Raghunath Prasad nodded slightly. Namaste. His voice was calm. The manager gestured toward his office. Would you please come inside for a moment? Several customers exchanged confused looks. A few whispered. The woman who had laughed earlier leaned toward the man beside her. Why is the manager treating him like that? The man shrugged. Inside the office, Mr. Deshmukh pulled out a chair. Please sit. Raghunath hesitated for a moment before sitting down. His daughter climbed onto the chair beside him. The manager closed the glass door. Then he sat across from them. He folded his hands on the table. Mr. Prasad, he said carefully, do you remember opening an account here in 1987? Raghunath nodded slowly. Yes. The manager smiled faintly. That account has been growing for a very long time. Raghunath looked down briefly. Then back up. I never closed it. No, the manager said. You didn't. He turned the computer screen toward him. Rows of numbers filled the display. Years of investments. Compounding interest. Government agricultural programs. All connected to a single account. Raghunath studied the screen quietly. He didn't react dramatically. He simply nodded again. As expected. The manager blinked. You expected this? Raghunath smiled slightly. My father always said something. What did he say? If you plant a tree and keep digging it up to check the roots, it will never grow. The manager leaned back slowly. And you believed him. I followed him. The assistant manager spoke for the first time. But sir, this amount. He stopped himself. Even saying it felt unbelievable. Mr. Deshmukh turned back to Raghunath. There's something else you should know. Raghunath looked at him. This account qualifies you for a special category of clients. What category? The manager paused. Then said it clearly. Private agricultural investor. Outside the glass walls, several customers were still watching. They couldn't hear the conversation. But they could see the shift. The manager standing respectfully. The farmer sitting calmly. The tension in the room had transformed into curiosity. And slowly. Something else. Regret. Because only a few minutes earlier. Those same people had laughed. Inside the office, the manager opened another document. There's also a land investment fund connected to your account. Raghunath frowned slightly. I remember signing something years ago. Yes, the manager said. It was part of a rural land preservation program. He clicked another file. Satellite maps appeared. Plots of farmland. Hundreds of acres. Across multiple districts. The assistant manager leaned forward. His voice dropped. Sir, this land value alone. Mr. Deshmukh nodded. Yes. He turned back to Raghunath. Mr. Prasad. The manager spoke slowly now. Because the number he was about to say would change how everyone in that building looked at this quiet farmer. For the past 35 years. You've been one of the largest silent investors connected to this bank. The room went still again. Even the air seemed heavier. Raghunath didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He simply rested his hands on the table. And asked one quiet question. So. Can my daughter open her savings account today? The manager looked at the little girl sitting beside him. She was holding a small cloth purse. The same purse she had walked in with earlier. Mr. Deshmukh smiled. Yes. She absolutely can. The manager pressed a button on the intercom. Mira, could you please bring the junior savings account forms to my office? Outside the glass walls, the employees looked at each other in confusion. A few minutes earlier, the same man had been asked to wait at the counter like an inconvenience. Now the branch manager himself was requesting forms for his daughter. The shift in atmosphere was impossible to ignore. Mira, the senior clerk, walked quickly to the office carrying a file. When she stepped inside and saw the farmer sitting across from the manager, she hesitated for a brief moment. But Mr. Deshmukh spoke calmly. Please help them open a savings account for the child. Mira nodded respectfully and placed the forms on the table. The little girl watched everything carefully. Her small cloth purse sat in her lap. Raghunath looked at the form for a moment before handing it gently to his daughter. What is your name? He asked her. She answered softly. Kavya. Mira smiled. Very nice name. She pointed to the blank space on the form. Can you write it here? The girl took the pen carefully and wrote her name in slow, uneven letters. Kavya. The manager watched quietly. For some reason, the moment felt heavier than a normal account opening. Maybe it was because of the contrast. Just minutes earlier, people in the lobby had assumed this farmer didn't belong here. Now the branch manager himself was overseeing his daughter's first bank account. Meanwhile, whispers had started spreading across the lobby. Customers were leaning toward each other, speaking in low voices. That's the same farmer who asked about the check. Yes. But why is the manager treating him like an important client? No idea. The cashier who had originally handled the check kept glancing toward the office. She could feel a knot tightening in her stomach. Something was clearly happening that she didn't understand. Inside the office, Mira continued filling out the form. Initial deposit, she asked. Raghunath looked at his daughter. How much do you want to save? The girl opened her cloth purse. Inside were a few folded notes and coins. She counted them slowly on the table. 50. 100. Another 100. 270 rupees. She pushed the small pile forward proudly. This is mine. Mira smiled warmly. That's a wonderful start. She began entering the amount into the system. But as she did, the assistant manager suddenly spoke. Sir. Mr. Deshmukh looked at him. Yes. The assistant hesitated. Then he leaned closer and whispered something quietly. The manager nodded slowly. Then he turned back to Raghunath. Mr. Prasad, may I suggest something? Raghunath listened. Since this is your daughter's first savings account, the bank would like to add a small welcome bonus. Raghunath raised an eyebrow. What kind of bonus? The manager smiled slightly. Nothing complicated. He typed a number into the system. Just a starting balance adjustment. Mira looked at the screen. Her eyes widened slightly. The deposit amount had changed. Instead of 270 Indian rupees. The balance now read 10,270 Indian rupees. The girl stared at the number. Papa, is that right? Raghunath looked at the manager. You didn't need to do that. The manager replied quietly. Sometimes the bank likes to welcome good families properly. Outside the office, more people were watching now. The tension had turned into curiosity mixed with embarrassment. Because the truth was beginning to spread quietly among the employees. The assistant manager had already whispered it to the cashier. And the cashier had repeated it to the security guard. The farmer standing inside that office was not just another villager. He was connected to investments that had grown for 35 years. Government agricultural bonds. Land preservation funds. Compounding deposits. Quiet wealth. The kind that never announces itself. The security guard looked again through the glass. The man in the worn kurta suddenly looked very different. Inside the office, Mira finished the paperwork. All done. She handed the small passbook to Kavya. This is your account. The girl held it carefully. Her eyes scanned the first entry. Balance, 10,270 Indian rupees. She smiled. Papa, I'm rich. Raghunath chuckled softly. No. He said gently. You're responsible now. The manager leaned back in his chair, observing them. There was something unusual about this man. Most wealthy clients demanded attention. They asked for private lounges, priority service, exclusive benefits. But Raghunath had walked in wearing dusty sandals and carrying a check for $15. And all he wanted was a small account for his daughter. After a moment, the manager spoke again. Mr. Prasad, if you have time today, there are some investment updates we should review. Raghunath stood slowly. Another day. The manager nodded. Of course. He stood as well. As they walked out of the office, the entire lobby grew quiet again. People pretended to look at their phones. Or fill out forms. But their eyes kept drifting toward the farmer and his daughter. The cashier straightened nervously as they approached the counter. For a brief moment, she considered apologizing. But the words didn't come out. Instead, she simply nodded politely. Raghunath didn't react. He took the passbook from his daughter, placed it carefully back into her cloth purse, and handed it to her. Keep it safe. She nodded proudly. As they walked toward the exit, the security guard stepped aside respectfully and opened the door. Outside, the late afternoon sun stretched across the street. Before leaving, the manager called out from behind them. Mr. Prasad. Raghunath turned. Government agricultural bonds. Land preservation funds. Compounding deposits. Quiet wealth. The kind that never announces itself. The security guard looked again through the glass. The man in the worn kurta suddenly looked very different. Inside the office, Mira finished the paperwork. All done. She handed the small passbook to Kavya. This is your account. The girl held it carefully. Her eyes scanned the first entry. Balance, 10,270 Indian rupees. She smiled. Papa, I'm rich. Raghunath chuckled softly. No. He said gently. You're responsible now. The manager leaned back in his chair, observing them. There was something unusual about this man. Most wealthy clients demanded attention. They asked for private lounges, priority service, exclusive benefits. But Raghunath had walked in wearing dusty sandals and carrying a check for $15. And all he wanted was a small account for his daughter. After a moment, the manager spoke again. Mr. Prasad, if you have time today, there are some investment updates we should review. Raghunath stood slowly. Another day. The manager nodded. Of course. He stood as well. As they walked out of the office, the entire lobby grew quiet again. People pretended to look at their phones. Or fill out forms. But their eyes kept drifting toward the farmer and his daughter. The cashier straightened nervously as they approached the counter. For a brief moment, she considered apologizing. But the words didn't come out. Instead, she simply nodded politely. Raghunath didn't react. He took the passbook from his daughter, placed it carefully back into her cloth purse, and handed it to her. Keep it safe. She nodded proudly. As they walked toward the exit, the security guard stepped aside respectfully and opened the door. Outside, the late afternoon sun stretched across the street. Before leaving, the manager called out from behind them. Mr. Prasad. Raghunath turned.